Miguel Santos wiped the sweat from his forehead as he looked at his old donkey standing in the small yard behind his house. The morning sun was already getting hot, and he knew it was going to be another long day of work. Esperanza stood quietly by the wooden cart, just like she did every morning for the past 7 years. Her gray coat wasn't as shiny as it used to be, and Miguel could see the years had been hard on both of them. He remembered the day he first brought her home. She was just a young donkey then, full of energy and ready to work. Miguel had saved up for months to buy her from an old farmer who was retiring. Back then Miguel had big dreams. He thought having his own donkey and cart would help him build a good business in San Luis Potosi. And for a while, those dreams seemed possible. Every morning, Esperanza would stand patiently while Miguel loaded the cart with whatever needed to be moved that day. Sometimes it was vegetables from the market to people's homes. Other days, it was furniture when families were moving to new houses. She carried bags of cement for construction workers and hauled water tanks to houses that didn't have running water. No matter what the job was, Esperanza did it without complaining. Miguel's neighbors often commented on how well behaved his donkey was. While other animals would get stubborn or tired, Esperanza kept working. When children ran up to pet her, she stood still and let them touch her soft nose. When dogs barked at her in the streets, she just kept walking. Even when cars honked loudly behind them, she never got scared or ran away. The people in the neighborhood knew Miguel and Esperanza well. Senora Rodriguez would always wave from her window when they passed by her house in the mornings. The shopkeeper at the corner store would sometimes give Esperanza a carrot when Miguel stopped to buy his morning coffee. The children playing in the streets would call out, "Hola, Esperanza!" and she would turn her head toward them as if she understood every word. But as the years went by, things started to change. Miguel noticed that Esperanza was walking slower than before. The hills that used to be easy for her now made her breathe harder. Sometimes she would stop to rest more often than she used to. Miguel told himself it was normal. After all, she was getting older, and they both weren't as young as they once were. What bothered Miguel more was watching other people in his business. Some of his competitors had bought horses instead of donkeys. Horses were faster and could pull heavier loads. A few had even managed to buy small pickup trucks. Miguel watched them drive past while he was still using the same old cart and the same old donkey. He started feeling embarrassed when customers asked why he didn't upgrade like everyone else, that the money wasn't coming in like it used to either. People wanted their deliveries faster now. They didn't want to wait for a slow donkey to climb hills or rest in the shade. Some customers started calling other delivery services instead of Miguel. He could see his regular customers slowly disappearing, and it worried him every night when he counted his earnings. Miguel began to blame Esperanza for his problems. When she walked too slowly, he would pull harder on her rope. When she stopped to rest, he would tap her with a stick to make her keep moving. The gentle way he used to talk to her changed into impatient commands. Instead of, "Come on, girl, we can do this together," he would say, "Hurry up, we don't have all day." Esperanza seemed to sense the change in Miguel's attitude, but she kept trying her best. Even when her legs hurt from walking on the hard roads all day, she would pull the cart. Even when the loads got heavier and Miguel became more demanding, she did what he asked. Her big brown eyes would look at him sometimes as if she was asking what had changed between them. The other cart owners in the area started talking about getting rid of their old animals. "These donkeys are holding us back," they would say during their coffee breaks. "We need to think about our businesses, not about some old animal's feelings." Miguel found himself nodding along with these conversations, even though something inside him felt uncomfortable about it. At home, Miguel's wife, Maria, would watch him come back each evening looking more frustrated than the day before. She could see how the stress was affecting him, but she also noticed how tired Esperanza looked. The donkey that used to eagerly eat her dinner now picked at her food slowly. The animal that used to greet Miguel with soft braying sounds when he came to the yard now just stood quietly in the corner. "Maybe we should think about retiring her," Maria suggested one evening as they watched Esperanza through the kitchen window. She's worked hard for us all these years. Perhaps she deserves some rest. But Miguel couldn't afford to retire Esperanza. He couldn't afford to buy a horse or a truck to replace her. He couldn't even afford to keep an animal that wasn't earning money. The pressure of supporting his family and keeping his business alive was crushing him, and every day that Esperanza moved a little slower felt like another step toward failure. Still, there were moments when Miguel remembered why he had loved his donkey so much. Sometimes when they were delivering something to a family with small children, Esperanza would lower her head so the kids could pet her more easily. When they passed elderly people sitting on their porches, she would slow down slightly, as if she knew they enjoyed watching her go by. These small acts of gentleness reminded Miguel of the bond they used to share, but those moments became rarer as the financial pressure grew stronger. Miguel found himself looking at Esperanza and seeing only the money she wasn't making and the speed she couldn't maintain. He started to forget about the thousands of deliveries she had completed successfully, the loyal service she had given him, and the fact that she had never once refused to work. No matter how tired she was, the neighborhood children still called out to Esperanza when they saw her, but Miguel noticed they were calling out less often. Maybe they could sense the tension between him and his donkey. Maybe they could see that something had changed in the way Miguel treated his faithful companion. Or maybe they were just growing up and finding other things to capture their attention. As Miguel prepared for what would turn out to be their last morning together, he had no idea that this day would change everything. He loaded the cart with pottery, just like he had done hundreds of times before. Esperanza stood patiently, just like she always did, but the patience and understanding that had carried them through 7 years of partnership was about to be tested in a way that would break them apart forever. The morning air was cool, and for a brief moment Miguel felt like maybe today would be different. Maybe today Esperanza would move faster and they would finish their deliveries early. Maybe today would remind him why he had chosen this life with this donkey. But as they headed toward the steep hill that led out of their neighborhood, neither Miguel nor Esperanza knew that their years of working together were about to come to a devastating end. The sun was already blazing hot by 8 in the morning when Miguel finished loading the last piece of pottery into his wooden cart. He had spent most of the previous evening carefully wrapping each clay pot and vase in old newspapers, making sure nothing would break during the journey across town. This delivery was important. The pottery maker had promised Miguel good money if everything arrived safely at the market before noon. Miguel counted the pieces. One more time? 32 beautiful clay pots, each one painted with bright colors and traditional designs. The pottery maker had worked for weeks to finish this order for a tourist shop near the main plaza. If Miguel could deliver them without any damage, he would earn enough money to pay his rent and buy groceries for the next 2 weeks. If even one pot broke, the pottery maker had warned him, he wouldn't get paid at all. Esperanza stood quietly beside the cart waiting for Miguel to attach her harness. She could sense his nervous energy this morning. Miguel was moving faster than usual, checking and rechecking the ropes that held the pottery in place. His hands were shaking slightly as he tied the final knot. The donkey had learned to read Miguel's moods over the years, and today he felt different. More tense, more worried. "Okay, girl," Miguel said as he led Esperanza to the front of the cart. "This is a big one today. We need to be extra careful." But even as he said the words, he was thinking about how slowly she had been moving lately. The market was on the other side of town, and they would have to climb the steep hill that led out of their neighborhood. Miguel had been dreading this hill for weeks now, watching Esperanza struggle more each time they had to go up it. They started their journey through the familiar streets of their neighborhood. Senora Rodriguez waved from her window like she always did, but Miguel was too focused on his worries to wave back. The children playing in the street called out, "Hola, Esperanza!" But Miguel didn't slow down to let them pet her like he usually did. He had one thing on his mind, getting those 32 pieces of pottery to the market in perfect condition. The cart felt heavier than normal, and Miguel could hear the pottery shifting slightly with each bump in the road. Every small sound made his heart beat faster. He had wrapped everything carefully, but clay pottery was fragile. One hard bump or sudden stop could mean disaster. As they walked through the neighborhood, Miguel found himself getting more and more anxious about the steep hill ahead. When they reached the bottom of the hill, Miguel stopped for a moment. The hill stretched up in front of them, looking steeper and longer than ever before. The morning sun was beating down, and he could already see sweat starting to form on Esperanza's coat. Other cart owners had found different routes to avoid this hill, but Miguel's cart was too wide for most of the narrow side streets. This was the only way to reach the market on time. "Come on, Esperanza," Miguel said, trying to sound confident. "We've done this 100 times before. Just take it slow and steady," but inside he was worried. The last few times they had climbed this hill, Esperanza had needed to stop and rest 3 or 4 times. Today, with the heavy load of pottery, Miguel wasn't sure she could make it at all. They started up the hill slowly. Miguel walked beside Esperanza, holding her lead rope and encouraging her with gentle words. For the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. The donkey was breathing harder than usual, but she was making steady progress. The cart wheels rolled smoothly over the paved road, and the pottery stayed secure in its newspaper wrapping. But halfway up the hill, Miguel noticed Esperanza starting to struggle. Her breathing became labored, and she began to slow down. Miguel could see the effort it was taking for her to pull the heavy cart up the steep slope. Sweat was dripping from her sides, and her legs were shaking slightly with each step. "Keep going, girl," Miguel urged, pulling gently on her rope. "We're almost to the top." But they weren't almost to the top. They were only halfway up, and Esperanza was already exhausted. Miguel could feel his anxiety turning into panic. If they didn't make it to the market on time, he would lose this job and probably several future jobs as well. A car honked behind them, wanting to pass. Miguel led Esperanza to the side of the road to let the car go by, but the brief stop seemed to make things worse. When they tried to start moving again, Esperanza was even more tired than before. Her steps became shorter and more labored. Miguel could see that every step was an effort for his old donkey. "Come on," Miguel said, his voice getting sharper. "We don't have time for this. People are counting on us." But Esperanza couldn't move any faster. The weight of the cart, the steepness of the hill, and the heat of the morning sun were too much for her aging body. Then it happened. About 3/4 of the way up the hill, Esperanza stumbled. Her front legs gave out, and she fell to her knees on the hard pavement. The sudden stop caused the cart to jerk forward, and Miguel heard the terrible sound of pottery crashing together inside the cart bed. Miguel's heart sank as he heard piece after piece of pottery breaking. The careful wrapping couldn't protect the clay pots from the violent movement of the cart. He could hear the pottery maker's beautiful work shattering into hundreds of pieces. All those weeks of careful crafting, all those hopes for a good payday, were disappearing in a symphony of breaking clay. Esperanza struggled to get back to her feet, but the effort had taken everything out of her. She managed to stand up, but Miguel could see that she was completely exhausted. Her legs were trembling, and she was breathing so hard that Miguel worried she might collapse again. Miguel rushed to the back of the cart and pulled away the canvas cover. What he saw made his stomach drop. More than half of the pottery was broken. Beautiful pots that had taken days to make were now just piles of colorful clay pieces. The newspaper wrapping was soaked with water from broken water jugs and pottery. Shards were scattered throughout the cart bed. All the frustration, worry, and financial pressure that had been building up inside Miguel for months suddenly exploded. He looked at Esperanza, standing there exhausted and trembling, and all he could see was the cause of his problems. All he could think about was the money he had just lost, the rent he couldn't pay, and the family he couldn't provide for. "Look what you've done," Miguel shouted at Esperanza. "Look at this mess. This is all your fault." The donkey flinched at the harsh tone in his voice. She had never heard Miguel yell at her like this before. Her big brown eyes looked at him with confusion and hurt, but Miguel was too angry to notice. People walking by started to stare at the scene. Some of them recognized Miguel and Esperanza from their years of working in the neighborhood. They watched in shock as Miguel began pulling the broken pottery from the cart, throwing the pieces onto the roadside. With each broken pot he pulled out, his anger grew stronger. 7 years. Miguel shouted, not caring who was watching. 7 years I've kept you fed and sheltered, and this is how you repay me? By destroying everything. Esperanza took a step back, frightened by Miguel's rage. She had never seen him like this before. The man who used to speak to her gently and share his lunch with her had become someone she didn't recognize. Miguel's hands were shaking as he unhitched Esperanza from the cart. The leather harness fell to the ground with a heavy thud. Esperanza stood there, free from the cart but confused about what was happening. She looked at Miguel, waiting for him to tell her what to do next, but Miguel wasn't looking at her anymore. Done with you," Miguel declared, his voice cracking with emotion. "Find someone else to disappoint." And with those words he grabbed the handle of his empty cart and began pulling it up the hill himself. Leaving Esperanza standing alone beside the pile of broken pottery, the donkey watched as Miguel disappeared over the top of the hill, pulling the cart that she had pulled faithfully for 7 years. She didn't understand what had just happened. All she knew was that the person she had trusted and worked for every day was walking away from her, and she was alone on a busy road with nowhere to go as cars continued to honk and drive around her. Esperanza stood in the same spot for almost an hour waiting for Miguel to come back, but he never did. Esperanza stood on the hill for what felt like forever, watching the spot where Miguel had disappeared with his cart. The broken pieces of pottery scattered around her feet caught the sunlight, creating tiny rainbows on the ground. But the beautiful colors couldn't hide the fact that her world had just fallen apart. She kept looking up the hill, hoping to see Miguel coming back for her. But the road stayed empty except for the cars that honked as they drove around her. The first hour was the hardest. Every sound made Esperanza turn her head, thinking it might be Miguel returning. When she heard footsteps, she would perk up her ears and take a few steps toward the sound. But it was always strangers walking by, and most of them crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her standing there, alone. Some people stopped to look at the broken pottery, shaking their heads at the mess, but nobody seemed to understand that a donkey's heart was breaking right there in front of them. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Esperanza began to feel thirsty. She was used to Miguel giving her water breaks during their workdays, especially when they had to climb difficult hills. But Miguel wasn't there anymore, and she didn't know where to find water on her own. She had spent 7 years following Miguel's lead, trusting him to take care of her needs. Now she had to figure out how to survive by herself. A group of children from the neighborhood came walking up the hill on their way to school. Esperanza recognized some of them as the kids who used to call out her name and pet her nose when she passed by their street. She walked toward them hopefully, thinking they might help her or at least give her some comfort. But when the children saw her approaching without Miguel, they seemed scared. "Where's the cartman?" one little boy asked his friend. "Why is the donkey here by herself?" The children backed away as Esperanza got closer, without Miguel there. To show them it was safe, the donkey suddenly seemed big and unpredictable to them. They hurried past her and continued up the hill to school, leaving Esperanza feeling even more alone than before. By noon, the sun was beating down mercilessly, and Esperanza was starting to feel dizzy from thirst and heat. She had never been on her own in the middle of the day like this. Usually, Miguel would find a shady spot for them to rest during the hottest part of the day, and he would share his water bottle with her. But there was no shade on this part of the hill, and no Miguel to take care of her. Esperanza started walking, but she didn't know where to go. She had walked these streets hundreds of times with Miguel, but she had always been following his lead. Now, with no cart to pull and no person to follow, everything looked different. The familiar neighborhood suddenly felt strange and confusing. She tried walking back toward the area where she and Miguel used to live, but when she got there, she realized she didn't know exactly which house was theirs. The streets all looked similar, with small houses painted in bright colors and narrow. Sidewalks crowded with people. Esperanza walked slowly down one street, then another, hoping to recognize something that would lead her home. But every time she thought she found the right street, it would turn out to be wrong. She was lost in a neighborhood she had known for 7 years. Some of the people who recognized her from her working days with Miguel tried to shoo her away from their houses. "Go home, donkey," they would say, waving their hands at her. "You don't belong here without your owner." But Esperanza didn't know how to explain that she was trying to find home, and that her owner had left her behind. As the afternoon wore on, Esperanza's thirst became desperate. She could smell water somewhere nearby, but she couldn't find it. Finally, she discovered a small puddle of muddy water in a pothole at the edge of the road. The water was brown and had oil floating on top of it from the cars that drove through the puddle. Esperanza knew this wasn't the kind of clean water Miguel used to give her, but she was so thirsty that she had no choice. The muddy water tasted terrible, but it helped her thirst a little bit. As she drank, a woman came out of a nearby house and started yelling at her. "Get away from there, you dirty animal! You're making a mess!" The woman picked up a small stone and threw it at Esperanza, hitting her on the side. The donkey jumped away from the puddle, water dripping from her mouth, and hurried down the street. This was the first time anyone had ever thrown something at Esperanza, and it scared her more than the thirst or the heat. All her life, people had been kind to her. Children had petted her, adults had spoken to her gently, and Miguel had protected her from anything that might hurt her. Now she was learning that the world could be a dangerous place for a donkey with no one to take care of her. As evening approached, Esperanza was exhausted from walking in circles around the neighborhood. Her legs ached, her throat was dry despite the muddy water, and her stomach was empty. She had never gone this long without eating. Miguel always made sure she had food in the morning and evening, and sometimes he would let her nibble on grass or weeds they found during their travels. Esperanza tried eating some of the weeds growing along the roadside, but most of them tasted bitter or made her feel sick. She wasn't used to finding her own food, and she didn't know which plants were safe to eat. Some of the grass near people's houses looked fresh and green, but every time she tried to eat it, someone would come out and chase her away. When darkness fell, Esperanza faced a problem she had never had before: where to sleep. For 7 years, she had slept in the small yard behind Miguel's house. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe and dry, and Miguel would always check on her before going to bed himself. Now she was wandering the streets with nowhere to go and no one. To protect her, she found a narrow alley between 2 houses that seemed quiet and dark. Esperanza thought she could rest there without bothering anyone, but she was wrong. About an hour after she lay down, a group of teenagers found her. They thought it was funny to see a donkey sleeping in an alley, and they started making loud noises to wake her up. "Look at this sad donkey," one of them laughed. "Someone threw away their old animal." They began throwing small rocks and pieces of trash at her just to see her reaction. Esperanza struggled to her feet and tried to get away, but the alley was narrow and the teenagers were blocking her path. For several frightening minutes, she was trapped while they continued to tease and throw things at her. Finally, one of the teenagers got bored and wandered away, and the others followed. Esperanza escaped from the alley and kept walking even though her legs were shaking with exhaustion. She was learning that being alone at night was dangerous, and that she couldn't trust all people to be kind to her. The second day was even harder than the first. Esperanza woke up stiff and sore from sleeping on the hard ground behind an abandoned building. The morning sun felt good on her coat, but it also reminded her that she was facing another day without food, clean water, or safety. Her ribs were starting to show through her gray coat, and her eyes had lost some of their shine. She spent the day wandering further from the neighborhood where she had lived with Miguel, following roads that seemed to lead away from the city. Some instinct told her that maybe she would find help in the countryside, or at least find better grass to eat and cleaner water to drink. But the roads were long and hot, and cars and trucks rushed past her without stopping. On the third day, Esperanza was barely able to walk. The little bit of muddy water and bitter weeds she had found were not enough to keep her strong. She had lost weight, and her once bright eyes now looked dull and sad. She had given up looking for Miguel and was just trying to survive one more. As she walked slowly along a road that led out of town, Esperanza began to lose hope. She didn't understand why Miguel had left her or what she had done wrong. All she knew was that the world had become a cold and unfriendly place, and that she was more alone than any creature should ever be. Carlos Hernandez had been riding in the back of a pickup truck for the past 6 hours, watching the countryside roll by as they returned from a cattle drive that had lasted 3 weeks. His body ached from sleeping on the ground and working. Long days under the hot sun, but his heart ached even more from the uncertainty about his future. At 34 years old, Carlos had spent most of his adult life working with cattle and horses. But steady jobs were getting harder to find. The cattle drive had been good work, but it was temporary. Once they delivered the herd to the processing plant, Carlos would be out of work again. He had enough money in his pocket to last maybe 2 weeks if he was careful with every peso. After that, he would have to find another job, and jobs for cowboys were becoming scarce in a world that was moving toward machines and modern farming methods. As the truck bounced along the dusty road, Carlos thought about his situation. 6 months ago, he had been working at a large ranch outside the city, taking care of hundreds of cattle and dozens of horses. The pay was steady, and he had his own small room in the ranch house. Life wasn't fancy, but it was good. Then the ranch owner decided to sell the property to developers who wanted to build houses, and Carlos found himself without a job or a home since then. He had been moving from one temporary job to another. Sometimes he would work for a week helping someone move cattle from one pasture to another. Other times he would spend a few days breaking in young horses for farmers who couldn't do it themselves. But nothing lasted long enough to give him the security he needed to plan for the future. The driver of the pickup truck was an old rancher named Don Roberto, who had hired Carlos for this cattle drive. Don Roberto was one of the few people left who still believed in doing things the old way, moving cattle on horseback instead of loading them into trucks. As they drove back toward town, Don Roberto had been unusually quiet, and Carlos suspected that the old man was thinking about retirement. "Carlos," Don Roberto finally said, glancing at him in the rearview mirror, "you did good work these past 3 weeks. I wish I had more jobs to offer you, but times are getting tough for all of us." Carlos nodded, understanding what the old man meant. Even the traditional ranchers were struggling to compete with modern cattle operations that could move more animals with fewer workers. The truck was still about 20 miles outside of town when Carlos spotted something unusual near an abandoned gas station. At first, he thought it might be a large dog or maybe a calf that had wandered away from a herd. But as they got closer, Carlos realized it was a donkey, and the animal was clearly in trouble. "Stop the truck," Carlos called out to Don Roberto. "There's an animal over there that needs help." Don Roberto pulled over to the side of the road, and Carlos jumped out before the truck had completely stopped. He had always had a soft spot for animals in distress, even when he couldn't afford to help them. As Carlos walked toward the donkey, he could see that she was in bad shape. Her gray coat was dull and dirty, and her ribs were showing through her skin. She was standing near a dried-up water trough behind the abandoned gas station, probably hoping to find something to drink. When she saw Carlos approaching, she lifted her head weakly, but didn't have the energy to run away. "Easy, girl," Carlos said softly, holding out his hand so the donkey could see he wasn't carrying anything that might hurt her. "I'm not going to harm you." The donkey's big brown eyes looked at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Carlos had seen that same look in the eyes of abandoned animals before, and it always broke his heart. Carlos moved slowly, talking to the donkey in gentle tones as he got closer. He could see that she was dehydrated and probably hadn't eaten a good meal in days. Her legs were trembling slightly, whether from weakness or fear he couldn't tell. There were small cuts on her legs from walking on rough roads, and her hooves looked worn down from traveling on pavement instead of soft ground. "What happened to you, little one?" Carlos asked, even though he knew the donkey couldn't answer. But he had worked with animals long enough to read their body language. And this donkey's story was written all over her condition. Someone had abandoned her, and she had been struggling to survive on her own for several days. Don Roberto walked over to see what was keeping Carlos. When he saw the condition of the donkey, he shook his head sadly. Probably got too old to work, the old rancher said. Some people just turn them loose when they can't use them anymore. It's not right, but it happens more than you might think. Carlos felt his jaw tighten with anger. He had seen abandoned animals before, but it never got easier to witness the cruelty that some people were capable of. This donkey had clearly been someone's working animal. She was too well behaved and too comfortable around people to have been wild. Someone had raised her, trained her, and then thrown her away like an old piece of equipment. We can't just leave her here, Carlos said, looking back at Don Roberto. She'd die if we don't help her. The old rancher sighed and looked at his watch. They still had a long drive ahead of them, and taking care of a sick donkey wasn't part of their plan. Carlos, I understand how you feel, Don Roberto said carefully. But what are you going to do with a donkey? You don't have a place to keep her, and you barely have enough money to take care of yourself. Don Roberto was right, and Carlos knew. He was living in a borrowed trailer on a friend's property, doing odd jobs to pay for food. Taking on the responsibility of caring for an animal was the last thing he could afford to do. But as Carlos looked at the donkey, he saw something that reminded him of his own situation. Here was a creature that had worked hard all her life, only to be abandoned when times got tough. She was struggling to survive in a world that had no place for her. Just like Carlos was struggling to find his place in a world that seemed to have less and less need for traditional cowboys. Carlos reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of beef jerky that he had been saving for later. He offered it to the donkey as she sniffed it carefully before taking it gently from his hand. As she chewed the small piece of meat, Carlos could see a tiny spark of life return to her eyes. I know exactly how you feel, girl, Carlos whispered. To the donkey, nobody wants us anymore, do they? The donkey finished eating the jerky and looked up at Carlos as if she understood every word he had said. In that moment, Carlos felt a connection to this abandoned animal that went deeper than logic or financial sense. Don Roberto was getting impatient. Carlos, we need to get going. The sun's going down and I want to get back to town before dark. Carlos looked at the donkey one more time, and she looked back at him with those big, hopeful eyes. He knew that if he walked away now, he would probably never see her again, and he knew that she probably wouldn't survive much longer on her own. Give me 5 more minutes, Carlos said to Don Roberto. He walked around the abandoned gas station, looking for anything that might help him understand where the donkey had come from. Behind the building, he found an old water hose that was still connected to a working spigot. Carlos turned on the water and let it run until it came out clear and cool. The donkey drank eagerly when Carlos led her to the water, drinking so much that Carlos had to pull her away before she made herself sick. As she drank, Carlos noticed a small white marking on her forehead that looked like a star. This wasn't just any donkey. This was someone's specific animal, with her own personality and history. Carlos made a decision that would change both their lives. He walked back to the truck where Don Roberto was waiting and asked for a piece of rope. I'm taking her with me, Carlos announced. Don Roberto stared at him as if he had lost his mind. Carlos, think about what you're doing, the old rancher said. You can barely take care of yourself. How are you going to take care of a donkey? Carlos had been asking himself the same question, but something inside him refused to walk away from this animal. I'll figure it out, Carlos said with more confidence than he actually felt. Maybe we can help each other. He fashioned a simple lead rope from the cord Don Roberto gave him and gently slipped it around the donkey's neck. She didn't resist, as if she understood that this man was her last hope for survival. As Carlos led the donkey toward the truck, he realized that he didn't even know her name. What should I call you? He asked her softly. The donkey looked up at him with those trusting brown eyes, and Carlos felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in months. For the first time since losing his job at the ranch, Carlos felt like he had a purpose again. Don Roberto helped Carlos get the donkey into the back of the pickup truck, shaking his head the whole time. "You're either the kindest man I know or the craziest," the old rancher said. "Maybe both." As they drove toward town with the donkey standing quietly in the truck bed, Carlos couldn't help but smile. He didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in months, he wasn't facing it alone. When Don Roberto's truck pulled up to the small trailer where Carlos had been living, Carlos felt a moment of panic. The reality of what he had just done hit him like a cold wave. He had rescued a donkey without having any real plan for taking care of her. The trailer belonged to his friend Luis, who had already been generous enough to let Carlos stay there rent-free while he looked for steady work. Now Carlos was about to ask if he could keep a donkey on the property too. The trailer sat on a piece of land about 10 miles outside of town, surrounded by scrub brush and a few scattered trees. It wasn't much to look at, but it had been home for Carlos for the past 4 months. There was no fence, no barn, and barely enough space for one person, let alone a person and a donkey. As Carlos helped the donkey down from the truck, he wondered if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. "Good luck, Carlos," Don Roberto said, shaking his head with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You're going to need it." The old rancher drove away, leaving Carlos standing in the dusty yard with a donkey that was looking around nervously at her new surroundings. Carlos looked at the donkey, and she looked back at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Carlos realized that he had been so focused on rescuing her that he hadn't thought about what would happen next. He didn't have donkey feed, a proper shelter, or even a bucket for water. All he had was good intentions and about 50 pesos in his pocket. "Well, girl," Carlos said quietly, "I guess we're both in this together now." The donkey's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and she took a small step closer to him. Despite everything that had happened to her, she seemed to sense that this man was different from the person who had abandoned her. Carlos's first priority was water. The donkey had drunk at the gas station, but she was still dehydrated from her days on the road. Carlos found an old plastic bucket behind the trailer and filled it with water from the outdoor spigot. The donkey drank carefully this time, not gulping the water like she had before. Carlos took this as a good sign that she was starting to feel a little safer. The next problem was food. Carlos went inside the trailer and looked through his small collection of groceries. He had some beans, a few tortillas, and half a bag of rice. It wasn't much for a human, and it certainly wasn't proper food for a donkey. But Carlos remembered seeing his grandfather feed donkeys when he was a child, and he knew that they could eat many of the same things that people ate. Carlos soaked some of the beans in water to make them softer, then mixed them with small pieces of tortilla. The donkey sniffed the mixture carefully before eating it. She was clearly hungry, but she ate slowly and politely, as if she had been taught good manners. Carlos could tell that someone had spent time training her properly, which made her abandonment even more heartbreaking. As the sun started to set, Carlos faced another problem. Where would the donkey sleep? He couldn't bring her inside the small trailer, and he couldn't just leave her wandering around the property. Using some old wire and wooden posts he found scattered around the yard, Carlos began building a makeshift corral. The work was harder than he expected. Carlos was tired from the cattle drive, and his hands were already sore from 3 weeks of rope work. But every time he looked at the donkey standing patiently nearby, he found the energy to keep going. She seemed to understand that he was building something for her, and she watched his progress with interest. By the time Carlos finished the simple corral, it was completely dark. The enclosure wasn't pretty, but it was secure enough to keep the donkey safe for the night. Carlos led her inside and made sure she had fresh water. As he was about to head inside the trailer, the donkey made a soft sound, almost like she was saying thank you. "Sleep well, girl," Carlos said softly. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." As he lay in his narrow bed that night, Carlos could hear the donkey moving around quietly in her corral. The sound was actually comforting. For months, Carlos had felt completely alone in the world. Now, for the first time, he had someone depending on him. Carlos woke up before dawn, which was unusual for him. Normally, he had to force himself out of bed, especially when he didn't have a specific job to go to, but today was different. Today he had responsibilities. He got dressed quickly and went outside to check on the donkey she was standing near the gate of the corral, and when she saw Carlos approaching, she made a gentle braying sound. It was the first time Carlos had heard her voice, and it made him smile. "Good morning to you too," he said, opening the gate to let her out. "Are you hungry?" Carlos shared his breakfast with the donkey, giving her some leftover beans and tortillas, while he ate the rest. As they ate together in the morning sunshine, Carlos started thinking about their situation more practically. He needed to find work, but now he also needed to find work that would allow him to take care of a donkey. Most of the jobs Carlos had been doing were cattle drives or ranch work that required him to be away from home for days or weeks at a time. Those jobs were no longer possible with a donkey to care for. Carlos would need to find work closer to home, work that would let him come back every day to feed and care for his new companion. After breakfast, Carlos decided to walk around the property with the donkey to see what possibilities might exist. The land was mostly flat and covered with sparse grass and weeds. It wasn't good enough to support a donkey full-time, but it was a start. As they walked, Carlos noticed that the donkey had a very calm and steady temperament. She didn't get startled by loud noises or sudden movements, and she seemed to enjoy exploring the property with him. When Carlos's friend Luis came by around noon to check on him, he was surprised to find Carlos sitting in the shade of a tree. "With a donkey?" "Carlos, my friend," Luis said, staring at the donkey in disbelief. "Please tell me you didn't steal someone's donkey." Carlos laughed and explained how he had found the donkey abandoned near the gas station. Luis listened to the story, shaking his head in amazement. "Only you would rescue an animal when you can barely feed yourself," Luis said. "But I have to admit, she's a beautiful donkey. What are you going to do with her?" "I'm still figuring that out," Carlos admitted. "Right now, I'm just trying to keep us both fed and healthy." Luis walked around the donkey, examining her carefully. He had grown up on a farm and knew something about animals. "She's been well cared for," Luis observed. "Someone trained her properly. Look how she stands still while we talk about her." Most donkeys would be nervous around strangers, Luis was right. The donkey seemed comfortable with both men, even though she had only known Carlos for less than 24 hours. "Maybe that's the answer," Luis said thoughtfully. "If she's well trained, maybe you could put her to work. There are still people around here who need things moved or hauled, especially in places where trucks can't go." Carlos hadn't thought about using the donkey for work. He had been so focused on saving her that he hadn't considered that she might be able to help him earn money. "Do you really think people would hire us?" Carlos asked. "Why not?" Luis replied. "You know how to handle animals, and she obviously knows how to work. There are still farmers around here who prefer the old ways. And there are always people who need help moving things in narrow spaces or rough terrain." The idea excited Carlos more than he expected. For months, he had been feeling like his skills as a cowboy were becoming obsolete. But maybe there was still a place in the world for someone who knew how to work with animals. Maybe he and the donkey could create their own kind of work, their own way of making a living. That afternoon, Carlos spent time getting to know the donkey better. He discovered that she responded well to voice commands and seemed to understand simple instructions. When he said walk, she would start moving. When he said stop, she would halt immediately. Someone had spent considerable time training her, and that training was still there, waiting to be used again. Carlos also discovered that the donkey had a gentle and patient personality. When he accidentally dropped a tool near her feet, she didn't jump or get startled. When a neighbor's dog came running over to investigate, she stood calmly while the dog sniffed around her legs. These were valuable traits for a working animal, especially one that would need to work around people and in busy areas. As the day ended, Carlos felt something he hadn't felt in months: hope. He still didn't have much money, and he still didn't have a steady job. But now he had a partner, someone who might be able to help him build a new kind of life. As he led the donkey back to her corral for the night, Carlos realized that rescuing her had been more than just an act of kindness. It might have been the smartest thing he had done in a long time. "Tomorrow, girl," Carlos said as he closed the gate to the corral, "we start working together. I don't know exactly what we're going to do, but I have a feeling we're going to figure it out." The donkey looked at him with those trusting brown eyes, and Carlos felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the evening sun. For the first time since losing his job at the ranch, Carlos felt like he had a real future ahead of him. Carlos woke up the next morning with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Today would be the first day he tried to work with the donkey, and he had no idea if his plan would actually succeed. He had spent half the night thinking about what Luz had said about putting her to work, and the other half worrying about whether he was asking too much of an animal that had already been through so much trauma. The donkey was waiting by the gate of her corral when Carlos came outside, and she greeted him with a soft braying sound that was becoming familiar. Carlos had decided to call her Esperanza, which meant hope in Spanish. The name felt right for an animal that had given him hope for a new future, just as he was giving her hope for a new life. "Good morning, Esperanza," Carlos said, opening the gate to let her out. "Are you ready to see if we can work together?" Esperanza walked out of the corral calmly and stood beside Carlos as he prepared their simple breakfast. The routine was already becoming natural for both of them after they ate. Carlos decided to start with simple exercises to test Esperanza's training and to build trust between them. He had fashioned a basic halter from some rope, and Esperanza allowed him to put it on her without any resistance. This was a good sign that she was used to being handled and was comfortable with. Carlos touching her head and neck, Carlos started by asking Esperanza to walk beside him around the property. She responded immediately to his voice commands and stayed at the perfect distance from his shoulder. When he said stop, she halted smoothly. When he said back up, she took several steps backward. Carlos was amazed at how well trained she was. Whoever had owned her before had done an excellent job teaching her basic commands. "You're a smart girl, aren't you?" Carlos said, patting Esperanza's neck. "Someone taught you well." Esperanza turned her head toward him when he spoke, as if she understood the praise in his voice. Carlos could see intelligence in her eyes, and he began to feel more confident about their chances of working together successfully. The next test was to see if Esperanza would pull weight. Carlos found some old tires behind Luz's house and tied them together with rope to make a simple sled. He attached the rope to Esperanza's halter and asked her to walk forward. At first, she seemed confused by the weight behind her, but once she understood what Carlos wanted, she leaned into the harness and pulled the tires easily across the yard. "Perfect!" Carlos exclaimed, unable to contain his excitement. "You remember how to work." Esperanza seemed to respond to his enthusiasm, stepping more confidently as she pulled the makeshift sled around the property. Carlos could see that she actually enjoyed having a job to do. Her posture became more alert, and there was a new energy in her movements. By the end of the first week, Carlos and Esperanza had developed a routine. Every morning they would practice different skills together. Carlos taught Esperanza to respond to new voice commands, and Esperanza showed Carlos just how capable and intelligent she was. She learned to back up to specific positions, to stand perfectly still while Carlos loaded and unloaded things from her back, and to navigate around obstacles with grace and precision. Carlos also spent time improving Esperanza's living conditions. He found some old lumber and built her a simple shelter that would protect her from rain and strong sun. He planted some hardy grass in a small area where she could graze, and he set up a system to collect rainwater for her to drink. Every improvement he made to her life seemed to make Esperanza more trusting and more willing to work with him. The breakthrough came when Luz's neighbor, Señora Martinez, asked Carlos to help her move some heavy pottery from her house to her car. Her grandson usually helped her with such tasks, but he was away at school. Carlos saw this as the perfect opportunity to test whether people would actually hire him and Esperanza for real work. "I have a friend who might be able to help," Carlos told Senora Martinez, "but she's a little unusual." When Carlos arrived at Senora Martinez's house with Esperanza, the elderly woman was delighted. She had grown up on a farm and loved animals. More importantly, she was impressed by how gentle and well-behaved Esperanza was. The pottery needed to be moved from Senora Martinez's backyard to her car in the front driveway. The pathway between the two areas was narrow and had several steps, making it impossible for a truck or cart to navigate. But Esperanza could easily walk the path while carrying pottery carefully packed in baskets on her back. Carlos loaded the pottery into special baskets he had made from materials he found around Luz's property. Esperanza stood perfectly still while he arranged the load, balancing the weight evenly on both sides of her back. When everything was secure, Carlos led her slowly along the narrow path, talking to her constantly to keep her calm and focused. The job took about an hour, and Esperanza performed flawlessly. She never rushed, never stumbled, and never showed any sign of nervousness around the valuable pottery. When they reached Senora Martinez's car, she helped Carlos unload the baskets, and every piece of pottery was in perfect condition. "This is wonderful," Senora Martinez exclaimed. "My grandson always complains about having to carry these heavy pieces, but your donkey makes it look easy." She paid Carlos more than he had expected and told him she would recommend his services to her friends. That evening, Carlos sat with Esperanza under the tree where they had started planning their future together. He counted the money Senora Martinez had paid him, and for the first time in months he felt financially secure. But more than that, he felt proud of what they had accomplished together. "We did it, girl," Carlos said, offering Esperanza a carrot he had bought with some of their earnings. "We're a real team now." Esperanza crunched the carrot happily, and Carlos could swear she looked proud. Word about Carlos and Esperanza spread quickly through the small community. People were curious about the cowboy and his donkey who could move things in places where trucks couldn't go. Within a few days, Carlos received calls from 3 different people who needed help with moving projects. The second job was helping an elderly man named Don Fernando move bags of feed from his truck to a storage shed behind his house. The shed was accessible only through a narrow gate and across a small field that was too soft for vehicles. Esperanza carried the heavy feed bags easily, making several trips back and forth until all the feed was safely stored. Don Fernando was so impressed that he hired Carlos and Esperanza to come back every month to help with his regular feed deliveries. "I've been worrying about how to manage these heavy bags as I get older," Don Fernando said. "Your donkey is the perfect solution." The third job was the most challenging yet. A young couple needed help moving furniture and boxes from their apartment to a moving truck, but the apartment was on the second floor of a building with narrow stairs. Carlos couldn't take Esperanza upstairs, but she could wait in the courtyard below while Carlos carried items down to her. Then she could transport everything from the building to the moving truck parked on the street. This job required perfect teamwork between Carlos and Esperanza. Carlos would carry items down the stairs and load them onto Esperanza's back, then walk with her to the truck where he would unload everything. Esperanza learned to stand perfectly still while Carlos arranged the load, and she walked carefully to avoid jostling fragile items. The couple was amazed by how efficiently the system worked. "We thought we would need to hire 4 people to help us move," the young woman said. "But you and your donkey are faster than a whole crew of workers." By the end of their second week working together, Carlos and Esperanza had completed 6 jobs and earned enough money for Carlos to buy proper feed for Esperanza, improve her shelter, and even put some money aside for emergencies. More importantly, they had proven that their partnership could be successful. Carlos began to see patterns in the types of work that were perfect for him and Esperanza. They were ideal for jobs that required moving things in tight spaces, navigating rough terrain, or working in areas where noise and emissions from trucks would be a problem. Esperanza's calm temperament made her perfect for working around children, elderly people, and valuable or fragile items. As Carlos brushed Esperanza's coat one evening, He marveled at how much both their lives had changed. A month ago he had been an unemployed cowboy with no prospects and no hope. Esperanza had been a donkey dying slowly on the side of a road. Now they were partners in a growing business, each one making the other's life better and more meaningful. "Tomorrow we're going to make a real business plan," Carlos told Esperanza as he led her to her corral for the night. "We're going to figure out how to let more people know about what we can do." Esperanza nuzzled his shoulder gently, and Carlos felt a warmth in his heart that had nothing to do with their financial success. He had found not just a way to make a living, but a true companion who understood him and trusted him completely. 3 months after rescuing Esperanza, Carlos found himself sitting at a small desk in the local print shop, designing his first business flyer. The idea still seemed almost too good to be true, but the numbers didn't lie. In just 12 weeks, he and Esperanza had completed over 30 jobs and earned more money than Carlos had made in his previous 6 months of searching for ranch work. "Carlos and Esperanza Landscaping and Moving Services," Carlos read aloud as he looked at the draft of their flyer. The printer, an older man named Don Alberto, smiled as he helped Carlos choose the right words to describe their unique business. "You." "No," Don Alberto said, adjusting his glasses to look at the design. "I've been in this business for 40 years, and I've never made a flyer for a cowboy and his donkey. But from what I hear around town, you two are becoming quite famous." It was true. Word about Carlos and Esperanza had spread far beyond their initial customers. People were talking about the polite young man and his well-trained donkey who could solve moving problems that no one else could handle. More importantly, customers were calling their friends and neighbors to recommend Carlos's services. The turning point had come when Carlos and Esperanza helped the local church move heavy wooden benches from their old building to a new location. The church courtyard was accessible only through a narrow gate and across a garden that the congregation didn't want damaged by heavy trucks. Esperanza had carried the benches one by one, walking carefully along the stone pathways without disturbing a single flower. Father Miguel, the church priest, had been so impressed that he mentioned Carlos and Esperanza during his Sunday sermon. "Sometimes," Father Miguel had told his congregation, "God sends us help in the most unexpected forms. This week, our help came in the form of a kind young man and a gentle donkey who treated our sacred space with more respect than most humans would." After that Sunday, Carlos's phone started ringing constantly. People from towns 30 miles away were calling to ask if Carlos and Esperanza could help them with moving projects. Some jobs were simple, like carrying groceries from a car to a house with a long, narrow driveway. Others were more complex, like moving furniture for families who lived in apartments without elevator access. Carlos had invested his earnings wisely. He bought a small pickup truck that he used to transport Esperanza to job sites that were too far to walk. He purchased proper saddlebags and carrying equipment designed specifically for pack animals. He even bought a cell phone so customers could reach him more easily, though he was still learning how to use all its features. Most importantly, Carlos had moved out of Luz's trailer and into a small apartment in town. The apartment came with a small yard that was perfect for Esperanza, and the location made it easier for customers to find them. Carlos had built Esperanza a proper shelter with a roof that kept her dry during the rainy season and shade that protected her from the hot summer sun. The transformation in Esperanza was remarkable. The thin, frightened donkey Carlos had found by the roadside had become a confident, healthy animal who seemed to take pride in her work. Her gray coat was now shiny and soft, her eyes were bright and alert, and she had gained back all the weight she had lost during her days of abandonment. More than that, Esperanza had developed a personality that made her perfect for customer service. She was gentle with children, patient with elderly customers, and careful around valuable or fragile items. Some customers requested Carlos's services specifically because they wanted their children to meet Esperanza, and Carlos never charged extra for the joy she brought to families. One particularly memorable job involved helping a family prepare for their daughter's Quinceañera celebration. The party was being held in a beautiful garden venue, but the catering truck couldn't access the garden area where the tables and decorations needed to be set up. Carlos and Esperanza spent 2 days carrying party supplies, decorations, and food. From the packing area to the garden. The birthday girl, a 15-year-old named Isabella, fell in love with Esperanza immediately. She insisted on helping Carlos load and unload the supplies, and she spent her free time brushing Esperanza's coat and feeding her carrots. When the party ended, Isabella's mother asked if Esperanza could stay for photos with the birthday girl. "She's the most beautiful donkey I've ever seen," Isabella declared as she posed for pictures with Esperanza, her elaborate Quincy-era dress flowing around them both. "Can I hire you to bring her to my wedding someday?" Carlos laughed and promised Isabella that he and Esperanza would be honored to help with her wedding when the time came. As he drove home that evening with Esperanza riding calmly in the back of his truck, Carlos reflected on how much their lives had changed. They weren't just making money anymore. They were making memories and bringing joy to people's important moments. The success of their business allowed Carlos to think about the future in ways he hadn't been able to before. He started taking a business class at the local community college, learning about accounting, marketing, and customer service. The instructor was initially skeptical about a donkey-based business, but she became one of Carlos's biggest supporters after seeing his financial records and customer testimonials. "You found a genuine market niche," Professor Rivera told Carlos during one of their meetings. "There are services that only you and Esperanza can provide, and you're building a business around that uniqueness. That's exactly what successful entrepreneurs do." Carlos also began thinking about expanding their services. He noticed that many of his customers needed help with yard work and landscaping projects that required moving heavy materials to areas where trucks couldn't go. Esperanza was perfect for carrying bags of soil, mulch, and plants through narrow garden paths and up steep hillsides. Their first major landscaping job came when a wealthy family hired them to help redesign the gardens behind their hillside home. The house was beautiful, but it was built on a slope that made it impossible for delivery trucks to reach the backyard. Carlos and Esperanza spent a week carrying hundreds of plants, bags of soil, and landscaping stones from the driveway to various parts of the garden. The job was physically demanding, but Esperanza seemed to enjoy the challenge. She learned to navigate the narrow garden paths with confidence, and she became skilled at carrying delicate plants without damaging them. The family was so pleased with the results that they hired Carlos to maintain their gardens on a monthly basis. Word about their landscaping skills spread just as quickly as news of their moving services had. Carlos found himself booking jobs weeks in advance, and he started keeping a waiting list for customers who wanted to hire them during busy seasons. The financial success was gratifying, but what meant even more to Carlos was the relationship he had built with Esperanza. They had become true partners in every sense of the word. Carlos could tell what Esperanza was thinking just by watching her body language, and Esperanza seemed to anticipate what Carlos needed before he asked for it. During their lunch breaks, Carlos would often sit in the shade with Esperanza and talk to her about their day, their customers, and their plans for the future. He knew that some people might think it was silly to have conversations with a donkey, but Carlos was convinced that Esperanza understood every word he said. "We did good today, girl," Carlos would say as they rested between jobs. "Mrs. Lopez said we're the best moving team she's ever hired. And did you see how happy those kids were when they got to pet you?" Esperanza would respond with gentle braying sounds or by nuzzling Carlos's shoulder, and Carlos felt understood in a way he had never experienced with another human. As their first year in business approached, Carlos began planning a celebration. He wanted to mark the anniversary of finding Esperanza not just as the day he rescued her, but as the day they both found their true purpose in life. He had been thinking about getting matching business shirts made for both of them, with Carlos and Esperanza landscaping services embroidered on the fabric. The idea of dressing up his donkey for work might have seemed ridiculous to some people, but Carlos's customers loved the professional appearance it would create. Several customers had already commented on how much they appreciated the care and pride Carlos took in his business, and matching uniforms would be one more way to show that professionalism. One evening, as Carlos was brushing Esperanza's coat and planning their schedule for the following week, he realized that he had stopped thinking about his old life as a ranch hand. The dreams of working on a large cattle operation seemed to belong to a different person now. Carlos had found something better than a job. He had found a calling that used all his skills with animals while allowing him to build something that was entirely his own. "Tomorrow we start our second year together," Carlos told Esperanza as he led her to her shelter for the night. "And I have a feeling it's going to be even better than the first." Esperanza looked at him with those intelligent brown eyes that had first captured his heart, and Carlos knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as true partners. 2 years had passed since that fateful day when Carlos found Esperanza abandoned by the roadside. Now, on a warm Tuesday morning, they were working on their biggest landscaping project yet, transforming the courtyard of a historic hotel in the center of San Luis Potosí. The hotel owners had hired Carlos and Esperanza specifically because they needed someone who could move delicate plants and heavy materials through the narrow corridors and doorways of the 100-year-old building. Carlos had arrived early that morning, driving his newer pickup truck with Esperanza riding comfortably in the custom trailer he had built for her. The trailer was painted with their business logo and contact information, and it had become a familiar sight around town. When people saw the Carlos and Esperanza Landscaping Services trailer, they knew quality work was being done nearby. The hotel courtyard project was scheduled to take 3 days, and Carlos was particularly excited about it because it would showcase their skills to hundreds of tourists and business travelers who stayed at the hotel. The job involved creating a beautiful garden space where guests could relax and enjoy their meals outdoors. Everything had to be perfect, from the placement of each plant to the arrangement of the decorative stones. Esperanza was wearing her professional saddlebags, custom-made from sturdy leather and designed to carry plants, tools, and materials safely through tight spaces. She had grown into the role of a professional working animal, and Carlos often marveled at her transformation from the frightened, abandoned donkey he had rescued to the confident, skilled partner she had become. As they worked that morning, Carlos noticed a man standing across the street watching them intently. At first, Carlos didn't pay much attention to him. Many people stopped to watch them work, fascinated by the sight of a donkey carefully carrying expensive plants through the narrow hotel corridors. But this man seemed different. He wasn't just curious. He appeared to be studying Esperanza specifically. Carlos was loading a particularly beautiful flowering plant onto Esperanza's back when the man finally crossed the street and approached them. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying a nervous tremor. "That's a very beautiful donkey you have there." "Thank you," Carlos replied politely, securing the plant in Esperanza's saddlebag. "She's an excellent worker and a wonderful partner." Carlos glanced at the man's face and noticed something familiar about his features. Though he couldn't place where he might have seen him before, the man stepped closer to Esperanza, and Carlos saw her ears prick up slightly. Esperanza had developed the ability to read people's intentions very accurately during her 2 years of customer service work, and something about this man was making her alert. "May I ask where you got her?" the man continued, his eyes fixed on the white star-shaped marking on Esperanza's forehead. Carlos felt a protective instinct rise in his chest. Over the past 2 years, several people had tried to buy Esperanza from him, offering large sums of money for what they saw as a valuable, well-trained animal. Carlos had turned down every offer without hesitation. "She's not for sale," he said firmly, even though the man hadn't asked to buy her. "Oh, I wasn't trying to buy her," the man said quickly. "It's just that she looks exactly like a donkey I used to own. Same gray color, same white marking on her forehead, same size. It's remarkable how similar they are." Something cold settled in Carlos's stomach as he looked more carefully at the man's face. Now he recognized the features that had seemed familiar. This man had the same nose and jaw structure as Esperanza, the way children sometimes resemble their parents. But more than that, Carlos could see something in the man's eyes that he didn't like, a look of ownership, of entitlement. "What happened to your donkey?" Carlos asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. The man shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his shoes before meeting Carlos's gaze again. "I had to let her go. She got too old to work properly, and I couldn't afford to keep feeding an animal that wasn't earning money. I turned her loose on a road outside of town about 2 years ago." Carlos felt his jaw tighten as the man's words confirmed his worst fears. This was Miguel Santos, the man who had abandoned Esperanza on that hill, leaving her to die beside the broken pottery. Carlos looked at Esperanza, who was standing very still now, her body language suggesting that she too had recognized her former owner. "You abandoned her," Carlos said, his voice carefully controlled. "You left her on a road to starve." Miguel's face reddened slightly. "I didn't have a choice," he said defensively. "My business was failing and she was slowing me down." She collapsed under a heavy load and broke a cart full of pottery. "I lost everything because of her." Carlos felt anger building inside him, but he forced himself to remain calm. Esperanza was watching the conversation carefully, and he didn't want to upset her with a confrontation. "So you think it was her fault that you lost your business?" Carlos asked. "Well, not entirely," Miguel backtracked, realizing how his words sounded, "but she was old and tired. She couldn't do the work anymore." "What was I supposed to do? Keep feeding an animal that couldn't earn her keep?" Carlos looked at Esperanza, who was alert and healthy, her coat shining in the morning sun. Her saddlebags were loaded with plants worth hundreds of pesos, and she was about to carry them safely through a complex route that would require skill, balance, and intelligence. This was the same animal that Miguel had dismissed as worthless. "Look at her now," Carlos said quietly. "Does she look old and useless to you?" Miguel studied Esperanza more carefully, taking in her good condition, her professional equipment, and her confident posture. For the first time, he seemed to realize that this wasn't just any donkey who happened to look like his former animal. This was his former animal, transformed into something he had never imagined possible. "This is her, isn't it?" Miguel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is my donkey. I can tell by that white mark on her forehead. I named her Esperanza when she was just a young animal." "You named her," Carlos repeated, feeling a surge of protective anger. "You named her Hope, and then you threw her away when you lost hope yourself." Miguel's eyes widened as he realized the full implications of what he was seeing. The abandoned donkey he had left to die had not only survived, but had become successful. More successful, it appeared, than Miguel himself. His clothes were worn and patched, his shoes were scuffed, and he looked like a man who was still struggling to make ends meet. "I've heard about you around town," Miguel admitted slowly. "People talk about the cowboy and his donkey who can do jobs that no one else can do. They say you're making good money, that you have customers all over the region. I never thought it could be her." Carlos watched Miguel's face as the man processed the reality of the situation. The donkey he had abandoned as worthless had become the foundation of a successful business. The animal he had blamed for his failures had gone on to help another man build the kind of success that Miguel had never achieved. "I want her back," Miguel said suddenly, his voice gaining strength. "She was my donkey first. I raised her from a young animal. If she's so valuable now, I deserve to benefit from that value." Carlos felt Esperanza tense slightly beside him, and he placed a gentle hand on her neck to reassure her. "She's not your donkey anymore," Carlos said firmly. "You gave up any claim to her when you abandoned her on that hill." "But I never sold her to anyone," Miguel protested. "Legally, she's still mine. I could go to the police and prove that she belongs to me." Carlos looked directly into Miguel's eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but steel-hard. "Go ahead," he said. "Call the police. Tell them how you abandoned your animal on a public road and left her to die. Tell them how you threw away a living creature because she couldn't make you money fast enough. See how sympathetic they are to your legal claim?" Miguel's confident expression began to waver as he realized the weakness of his position. Even if he could prove that Esperanza had once belonged to him, explaining how he had lost her would not paint him in a favorable light. Besides, Carlos continued, look at her, really look at her. Does she want to go with you? Both men turned to observe Esperanza, who had been listening to the entire conversation. When Miguel stepped toward her, she moved closer to Carlos, clearly indicating her preference. When Carlos spoke to her, her ears perked up and she focused on him attentively. There was no doubt about where her loyalty lay. She's happy here, Carlos said simply. She has good food, a comfortable home, work that she enjoys, and someone who values her for who she is, not just for what she can earn. Why would you want to take that away from her? Miguel stared at Esperanza for a long moment, and Carlos could see an internal struggle playing out on the man's face. Part of him seemed to genuinely recognize that Esperanza was better off with Carlos. But another part of him was clearly thinking about the money he could make if he could reclaim a valuable, well-trained donkey. I could offer you a fair price for her, Miguel said finally. More than you probably paid since you found her as a stray. We could both benefit from this situation. Carlos shook his head slowly. You still don't understand, do you? She's not a piece of equipment to be bought and sold. She's my partner. We built this business together. Every success we've had,